Oh, I always worry about that.
All three of us are going to be mad at you.
Well, even if you weren't mad at me, I think it's a way to honor everybody by not keeping us over. If you have a Bible and you want to follow along, please turn in it to Luke chapter 22. This is where this will all come from today. This whole episode in Jesus' life is one of just absolute raw injustice. None of this is just. None of this is fair. None of this is in any way proper. None of this should even be happening. He's mistreated. He's mocked. And the real tragedy here is that makes this all so amazing, in my mind anyway, is that these are the people who are the conscience of the Jewish nation who are putting Jesus through all of this. The very priests, Sadducees, Pharisees, various people, scribes, people who know the Tanakh in great detail, are the ones who are doing this. It reminds me of the period in Christian history where you had the Spanish and the Portuguese Inquisitions, where people were tortured to bring out confessions of heresy or confessions of some kind of sin in their lives, that the very people who were to be the conscience of Christianity in the world, the priesthood, were torturing people and doing violence to people. This is exactly what you see in Jesus' time. The people who are the conscience of the Jewish nation are doing violence to the very one whom they ought to have recognized. That's amazing to me. Let me read the text. It begins in verse 63. We've just had Peter's denial and Peter's utter brokenheartedness over the fact that he's denied Jesus, just as it was prophesied he would. In verse 63, we pick up the narrative. Now the people who were holding Jesus under guard began to mock him and beat him, blindfolded him, and then they asked him repeatedly, "Prophesy to us, who hit you?" They also said many other things against Jesus, reviling him. When the day came, and the council of the elders, that is the Sanhedrin, of the people gathered together, both priests, experts in the law, they all led Jesus away to this council, and the council said to Jesus, "If you're the Christ, tell us." But Jesus said, "If I tell you, you won't believe me. And if I ask you who I am, you won't answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And they all said, "Are you the Son of God then?" Jesus answered them, "You say that I am." They said, "What need do we have of further testimony? We've heard it ourselves from his own lips." Nothing is right in the world here. This is an upside down world. I want to read for you. I don't like to read things too much in sermons, but I am going to read this because I can't recite it. H.G. Wells, the science fiction author from the 19th century, whom G.K. Chesterton debated repeatedly, both in print and live, said this. He wrote this as a parody of what the world looked like to him if there was a God. And this is what he wrote. And he uses the metaphor of a play and a stage set to say the stage of the world and God as the producer. The curtain rises, the set is perfect, a treat to every eye in the audience. The characters are resplendent in their costumes. Everything is going well. Suddenly, the leading man steps on the hem of the leading lady's gown, causing her to fall down. She trips over a chair, knocks over a lamp, which then pushes a table into the wall, which in turn knocks over all the scenery, which then all falls down upon all the actors' heads. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, God, who is the producer and running this, is running around shouting orders, pulling strings, trying desperately to restore chaos, order from chaos. And this is his perspective on the way the world looks. I'm going to say, if I weren't a believer, that's how it would look to me. That tells me this is a perspective from the outside looking in, not a perspective from the inside looking out. That's our perspective, is the inside looking out. So these chaotic things look very different to us than they do to H.G. Wells and to most people. Jesus is in front of the high priest. He is in an illegal examination that night. It's illegal. They're not supposed to try anybody. They're not supposed to do anything like this at night. That was Jewish law. It's a private examination too. There are no witnesses there for Jesus. It's an attempt to get Jesus to incriminate himself. And so then they hand Jesus over to the temple police overnight to keep him until the morning. And somebody from the high priest's household must have been sent out to gather as many Sanhedrists as they could to sit on the council of the 70, which was the Jewish Sanhedrin that tried cases like this. So they've got to hold Jesus until morning because the Sanhedrin cannot meet at night either. 70 members, scribes, Pharisees, rabbis, priests, Sadducees, all of the lawyers, the intelligentsia were the 70 people that were chosen to sit on the Sanhedrin council. They would come into a room which was called the room of hewn stone. And it was a room that was built into the temple, half in and half out. And this hewn stone room, the hall of hewn stone, was the place where they opened doors up into the sanctuary portion of the temple, and behind that would be this place where they had 70 chairs set in a semicircle. And if you were tried before the Sanhedrin, you were brought inside the semicircle to be questioned and tried. There would be a gallery behind you, which was part of the sanctuary of the temple, and people would come in there who would be either witnesses for or against you, or just people coming in because they wanted to see maybe your family member or something of the accused. And the prisoner would face the semicircle, and they would always dress the prisoner in mourning clothes, not daytime mourning in terms of like a funeral. This didn't happen for Jesus. The people who were brought in, if you were in the gallery, you could speak for the prisoner and you could speak against the prisoner, but you could not change your testimony in both directions. If you spoke for the prisoner, you could not change your testimony to speak against. If you spoke against, you could change your testimony to speak for. The 70, the only way they could get a conviction was by a majority of 2, but they could get an acquittal by a majority of only 1. If the conviction was a sentence unto death, they would not pass that sentence until they'd all gone home and slept on it for a night, then they would come back. None of this happened for Jesus. This is a completely illegal proceeding. And the Jews, I'm sure they knew it. But you see, they're not trying to find out what's going on here. They are trying to do everything they possibly can to get a conviction of blasphemy on Jesus, because they know then they've got the right to take Jesus' life. In other words, they're steering the proceeding toward a goal. This is not an investigation where they're going to say, well, let's find out. No, they've already decided, and now they're steering everything in order to get this conviction so that they can justifiably have Jesus put to death. You know, it shows me something about human nature. This is why the United States has been so careful to have a separation of church and state. That separation is not there to be anti-Christian or anti-church. It's there because they do not want the state linked with the altar. This is the state linked with the altar. Now that's good if you're dealing with a real theocracy, like before Saul had become king. When you had the period of the judges, and the judges functioned as a prophet and a leader, and they were God's mouthpiece to the people, that's a theocracy that's good. But when you have this kind of theocracy where you have independent rulership, and now they're going to link the altar to that, that's when you can do all kinds of terrible things. That's what happened during the Inquisitions. That's what's happening here. And then you've got something else going on. You've got what's known in psychology as mob mentality. There's a group here. Look at the way the temple police, that was the temple police that held Jesus overnight, the temple guards. Look at what they do as a group. No one of them would have beaten Jesus. No one of them would have blindfolded him and charged him to say, who hit you? None of them would have done any of that on their own. But when you get a group of people and you get a few instigators, pretty soon people are doing things they would never do otherwise.
Yeah.
Never. You think about the Nazis and what they did to children in Auschwitz and other places, Buchenwald and Belsen. And no one Nazi would have done that by themselves. It took the group. So just imagine the terror here. Jesus standing in this place, helpless. I'm sure he's bound, blindfolded, and being bare-knuckle punched and beaten with whatever, standing there, taking all of this. Normally people, when they get this kind of beating, they will fall on the floor into a fetal position, trying to protect as much of their vitals as they possibly can. I don't know if that happened here, but I would suspect, just given the way the text reads, Jesus was being held up to be beaten. Held up, exposed to the beating. Punching him, saying, you tell us who hit you. But Jesus had prophesied all this. Luke 18. Son of Man, we handed over to the Gentiles, who'd be mocked, mistreated, spat on. They'll flog him severely, and then they'll kill him. So here's Jesus standing in front of this Sanhedrin. I doubt all of them were there. I doubt they could get the whole 70 assembled on such short notice, first thing in the morning like that, after the night that Jesus had endured. By the way, on Sabbath's Eve, I very seriously doubt they could have gotten them together. Imagine, there they are seated, and they bring Jesus in. You know that he's just dripping blood from all sorts of wounds. Bruised, his face probably isn't even recognizable. That's the way Isaiah reads, that he was not recognizable. So, of these people who are assembled, not one of them that I can detect had any compassion for Jesus. Being beaten like this, knowing that they are the conscience, they are the religious conscience of the nation. Must have been confusing to them when Jesus stands there and silently accepts all of this in this kind of just all that he looks like, but there's this kingly kind of specter of Jesus, like a king. It's like they're on trial, in a sense. So he stands before the Sanhedrin. He's asked straight out, and he gives 3 titles to them, all of which say who he is. The first title is the Christ. Are you the Christ? He says, you say I am. Why did he say that way? Because he's going to let them tell him who he is, so that when they have him put to death, they know who they're putting to death. They know who this is. And Jesus never used that title for himself. He always used Son of Man. The reason is because Mashiach, had political ramifications both for the Jews and for the Romans. The Romans saw it as an insurrectionist. The Jews saw it as the person who's going to come and conquer Rome and drive them out. So Jesus didn't speak of himself that way very often. Second title is Son of Man. He used that one 80-something times in the Gospels. This goes straight back to Daniel. And Jesus knows, Jesus is a smart guy, he knows that when he uses that term for himself, referring to the prophecy in Daniel, he knows that every person on that council knows exactly what he means by it. I'm deity. I'm God. I'm coming back on the clouds to judge all of you. Thirdly, he uses the term Son of God. And this was the one that really turned everybody, because the linkage there between Son of Man and Son of God for the Jewish mind was, this is God himself in the flesh, the incarnation. This is the Messiah was going to share in God's nature. They all understood that. So he's eliminated all the outs. There's no confusion about Jesus' self-assessment anymore. Everybody knows the priest tears his robes. You see that recorded in Mark. The Sanhedrin think this is their hour. We got him. He's admitted to it. We don't need to hear anymore. The condemnation was, if you were going to make a condemnation of blasphemy, the sentence was stoning. And you know what's interesting? You see in the Talmud that they were going to stone Jesus of Nazareth for sorcery. That's the charge in the Talmud. That would be the means of execution. But the Jews aren't allowed to do that. So now they're going to march him in front of Pilate later to try to get an accusation of insurrection so that Pilate can have him put to death. The Romans can do their work for them. But Jesus doesn't leave them any hiding place. That's why he responded to them in the way that he did, making them admit who he really is. Because now they're going to make who they have admitted he really is. Jesus is making them put that person to death. That's why you can see Peter standing on the steps of the temple and proclaiming, "This Jesus whom you crucified." That's how the charge gets held over their heads. He doesn't leave them a hiding place at all. And he doesn't leave one for any of us. No hiding place. No hiding place for any human on this earth. I remember I had a conversation with a member of my own family who was not a believer. I was a young believer, a few months. And the only thing I knew to ask was, I said, "Well, who do you say Jesus is?" And they answered me rightly. They said, "Oh, he's the Son of God." But I knew they didn't believe. You see, God's not looking for you and me to satisfy the pop quiz just before we enter eternity. That is not salvation. What God is asking for is that the human heart would be surrendered to Him. And He knows whether that's true or not of any of us in this room or anybody on this planet. He knows whether or not the heart is surrendered to Him or not. That's what's going to gain you and I and anybody else entrance into eternity with Him. Not that we just know who He is. That's very different. Very different. Salvation is wanting God in a relationship and being willing to surrender to Him in the way that He's provided, Jesus on the cross, paying the debt for you and me, and asking God to provide us that mercy on the basis of what Jesus did, not on the basis of what we've done. And we can fool ourselves about that. We can fool each other. But we'll never fool God. He knows whether or not we belong to Him or not. But thank the Lord. Think now. Thank the Lord. If we do belong to Him, we have forever with Him, and nothing can change that. Not the COVID virus, not a war, not a divorce, not anything. If we're His, we're His. And that settles it because of what Jesus did. I don't know where everybody is, but if there's anything you'd like to ask me about this sermon, talk to me, pray with me. I'll stay here as long as it takes as we close. Let's just close in prayer, shall we?